If you had a Bible, we are going to be in the book of Daniel again tonight. Got some more work to do in Daniel, so you can go ahead and be turning there in your Bibles. And as we do that, let's try to do some time traveling for a moment. And let's go back to the days when people used to get together and sit together and listen to the radio, okay? So I'm going to play a little radio clip for you here in just a moment, and I'm going to pause it a little ways through it, and maybe somebody at that point can tell me whose voice it is that you're hearing on the radio. So we ready to listen? Here we go.
Odessa Lee Grady was a sweet, old-fashioned girl. She loved to stay home, loved to cook, attended Baptist church every Sunday, never drank, never smoked, never meddled in anybody else's business. Her creative urge was satisfied by making her own clothing and draperies for her home. So it just stood to reason that this sweet, old-fashioned girl would marry a nice, old-fashioned fellow. She did.
Is that loud enough for you? You hear it okay? Anybody recognize that voice? Paul Harvey. Okay, Paul Harvey on the radio here, and Paul Harvey was famous for saying something. What was Paul Harvey famous for saying? I know Walter's going to know this based on that reaction. Now you know the rest of the story. Well, to be perfectly honest with you, I had to do a little educating of myself for this example here because I had heard that name, Paul Harvey, several times. And I had heard several times people use his famous phrase, usually kind of imitating it a little bit with the tone of their voice as they said it, but I had never actually heard any of these stories told on the radio by Paul Harvey. So I did a little digging on the internet this week, and I came across this one here that you just heard a little part of there. I suppose we do have to finish it. I've cut down now to the very end, near the end of it. And the remainder of this little broadcast is about that woman that you just heard about and her husband and the child that they have, and some interesting things that happen when this child was born. So let's hear the rest of the story.
And at 6:35 p.m., on the 17th day of January, at Louisville's General Hospital, the little boy was born. The forceps scars on his cheek would always be there, a barely perceptible badge of triumph. And the proud parents hoped that everything would now return to wonderful, blissful, dependable normal. But not yet. You see, only a short while after his birth, and still in the hospital, the infant boy disappeared. More precisely, he was replaced. Mommy was the only one who knew, although not even she realized at first. She had asked to see her baby, and a nurse had brought her a newborn infant, and Lee had 10, maybe 15 minutes before it dawned on her the child she was cradling in her arms was not her child. She blinked. She stared. Could she trust her feelings? Ooh, you bet she did. So Lee rang for the nurse. "Where's my baby?" she demanded. "Why, this is your baby," the nurse answered calmly, to which Lee insisted that the infant was most certainly not her own, and she was right. And after a search, the embarrassed hospital staff apologetically returned Lee's son, and of course the other infant, to his rightful mother. And what the maternity ward nurses wanted to know was, how had Lee been so certain that she had the wrong baby? She said the other baby was just too quiet. Sure enough, even as she spoke, her own little boy was squalling, hollering, making such a racket that all the other babies in the ward started crying in response. It was a sign of things to come, because Lee's baby was destined to make a big noise in this world. Even as an infant, he tried with all of his might to talk. Once he learned how, he talked quite a bit. You see, the son of Odessa Lee Grady Clay source of that big noise that echoed throughout Louisville, Kentucky's General Hospital, January 1942, he, little Cassius Clay, one day became Muhammad Ali. Now you know the rest of the story.
There, of course, you have that famous line at the end. Now you know the rest of the story. Now, many of you, from the reaction you gave when I started this, showed me how popular these may have been or how well known they might have been at the time. I want to say something also, though, about why it is that stories like that work so well, why they're interesting to us. And I listened to several of them, actually, just thinking about it, pretty interesting even still today. The reason that a story like that works so well is because it withholds that one important detail, right, until the very end of the story. And in this case, we have this child with the scar on his cheek and this child with the loud and boisterous spirit, and we don't know until the end that that child is Muhammad Ali. But once you know that detail, well, it's like everything else that you just heard kind of just starts to make sense. And more than that, all of the different pieces of the story, all the rest of his story, you hardly even need to say anything about it because that one detail really just says it all. Everything else kind of falls into place in your mind. Because once you know whose story it is that we're hearing here, the rest of the story becomes really clear. Now, tonight we have some finishing up of stories that we need to do. So last time we were together, we were talking about Daniel chapter 6, and we were midway through that chapter. And what we had just seen in that chapter was the hero of that story, Daniel, resolutely climbing the steps of his home to that upper room, and he opened up the window, and as was his custom, he prayed toward Jerusalem to his God. And he did this knowing full well that what he was doing was against the law now in his country, knowing full well that what he was doing would face a severe punishment if anybody saw him doing it. And that's where we left off in that story, so we're going to hear the rest of that tonight. We were also midway through another story from the 1940s about this little village in France with this little congregation there that became a surprising safe haven for some of the Jewish refugees that were fleeing at the time that France was taken over by Nazi Germany. And when we last left off in that story, we saw the incredible courage of that village when an upper official from the German army arrived in their town after they had been safely hiding these Jews for a while unnoticed. And that official arrived in town, and the town banded together and wrote a letter and said, "We, according to the gospel, don't make distinctions amongst people. And we have Jews, but you're not getting them," is what they said at the end of that letter. And we're going to hear the rest of that story tonight, too. In each of those stories, we see this incredibly brave, one might even say like reckless bravery in the face of extreme danger. And to an outsider looking in on those stories, someone might wonder why it is that these people act so brazenly. Where did this confidence come from? This defiant and unyielding spirit, this allegiance to their faith that's so strong. Why is it that they have so much courage in them? Take, for example, King Darius as that outsider looking in on Daniel's story. Right at the beginning of chapter 6, King Darius he's the new king in town. It was not until the very last verse of chapter 5 that King Darius took the throne when the Medes and the Persians conquered the Babylonians at the end of chapter 5. And so when Darius takes the throne, he carries over some of the leadership from Babylon, and amongst those people leading Babylon was Daniel. He was one of them. And even early on, we find that Darius really admires Daniel. He sees something in Daniel, even as the new king in town. But just how much he knows about Daniel is unclear. What's clear is that when Darius finds out that his brand new rule, the rule that said that you can't pray to anybody, any god or any person other than himself for 30 days, when Darius finds out that his new rule is going to endanger Daniel, Darius is filled with regret about that, isn't he? That was not what he had in mind. So if you look at your chapter and you see verse 11, verse 12, and verse 13, that's when the other officials come. And they've laid that trap for Daniel, and they found him just as they expected to, at the window praying like he always did. And they come to Darius and they say, wouldn't you know it, Daniel broke your law. And Daniel was praying to somebody that he wasn't supposed to be praying to, because everybody's supposed to be praying only to you, Darius. And you know that your laws are irrevocable. They can't be repealed. And when they tell Darius what Daniel has done, and the king hears these words, the Bible says, verse 14, that he was much distressed about this. And he set his mind to deliver Daniel, and he labored till the sun went down to rescue him. And a verse like this tells me that if Darius had really thought about what this law would do to Daniel, or if he had known, perhaps, just how committed Daniel was to his faith, what he was going to do, Darius might not have done a thing like this. But apparently he did not think or did not realize that Daniel was going to do what Daniel does. And as Darius worked all night trying to undo this trap, I sure would like to know, what is Darius thinking about what Daniel has just done? He so admires him. But did it make sense to him? Did Darius look at Daniel and say, why couldn't you just have closed the window, my friend? Couldn't you have waited 30 days? Why'd you have to go and do such a rash thing? Why did you do this, Daniel? To Darius, the answer to those questions may not be clear. But if Darius had known just one detail back then, if Darius had known just one small thing that he didn't know, then all of Daniel's actions would have made perfect sense. And in fact, if Darius had known this one detail, he would have known the rest of the story. So then the king, realizing he couldn't untangle this mess, verse 16, the king commanded, and Daniel was brought and cast into the den of lions. And the king declared to Daniel, may your God, whom you serve continually, deliver you. And a stone was brought and laid on the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet and with the signet of his lords, that nothing might be changed concerning Daniel. And then the king went to his palace and spent the night fasting. No diversions were brought to him, and sleep fled from him. But at daybreak, the king arose and went in haste to the den of lions. And as he came near to the den where Daniel was, he cried out in a tone of anguish. The king declared to Daniel, O Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to deliver you from the lions? Then Daniel spoke. Daniel said, O king, live forever. my God sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths, and they have not harmed me, because I was found blameless before him, and also before you, O king. I have done no harm." Then the king was exceedingly glad and commanded that Daniel be taken up out of the den. So Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no kind of harm was found to be upon him, because he had trusted in his God. See, the one detail that Darius didn't know back then, the one detail that would have made all of Daniel's actions make sense, the one detail that would have told the whole rest of the story, was this: the God of Daniel delivers his faithful ones. The God of Daniel delivers his faithful ones. Like, this is the thing that Darius didn't know when he tossed and turned in his bed that night. This is the thing that Darius did not know as he asked himself, "Why, Daniel? Why didn't you just lay low for a while?" What Darius didn't know is that this really isn't a Daniel story. This is a God story. It's a story about the one true God and what that God does for the sake of those who trust in him, which is what Daniel did. What God does for those who trust in him is he delivers them. He rescues them. He vindicates them. He proves them right for putting their trust in him. And that's exactly what happens for Daniel. When Daniel opened up his window and prayed, he was not acting irrationally. He knew that the law forbade it. But what Daniel did that day, it made perfect sense. It made sense if you believe with all of your heart that there is a God who is stronger than the lions in that den. And if you believe in your heart that there is a God who delivers his faithful ones. And that's why he's able to show such courage as he shows, because Daniel knows this one detail in a way that Darius was missing. Daniel knows this detail, and for him, the rest of the story need not be told. Daniel knows the rest of the story. And if we put our trust in God like Daniel did, we can know the rest of the story too. We can know that the God of Daniel is alive and well today, and we can know that the God of Daniel still delivers his faithful ones, just as he did for Daniel, just as he did for Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego, just as he did for Joseph in Egypt, just as he did for Christ himself at the cross, just as he promised to do for his church, to whom he said, "Be faithful unto death, and I will give you the crown of life." When you know this about our Lord, then you know the rest of the story. Now, you and I might not know exactly how things will turn out immediately in our lives, in the situations that we face. I would argue maybe Daniel didn't either. Certainly Daniel's friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, realized that immediate deliverance from the danger that they faced might not be what they get from the Lord. You remember how as they stood up before King Nebuchadnezzar, they said, "God can save us from this furnace, but if he does not," they don't know for certain how exactly this specific moment's going to turn out. But they are acting as though they believe in the deliverance of God, that it will come sooner or later. And Daniel does too. And we can too. Whether it's immediate or down the road, whether it's in this life or in the next, the God of Daniel still raises up his faithful ones, even raises them from the dead. And when you know that detail, it's like the detail that makes everything else clearer. The faithful life that he calls us to, and why we can put our trust in him, all that becomes clearer. When we know this about our God, we know the rest of the story. We actually know what Darius comes to see. For the God of Daniel is the living God, enduring forever. His kingdom shall never be destroyed. His dominion shall not end. He delivers and rescues. He works signs and wonders in heaven and on earth. He who has saved Daniel from the power of the lions. This is the Lord who delivers the faithful. So what about those folks in France that we talked about last week? The ones who said, "We have Jews, you're not getting them," when they were confronted. May wonder what became of their story. Well, from one perspective, you can probably imagine what could happen, maybe even you might think should have happened. If you just straight up tell a leading officer in the Nazi regime, "We have Jews, we're hiding in this town," you can imagine what might have happened for those refugees and for the town that said that. And if those things had happened, God would have still been the God who delivers his faithful ones. But in this case, kind of like in Daniel's case, the faithful courage of those French villagers, those Christians there, made such a profound impression on the people, the outsider looking in, that person was emboldened too. And in those days, there was another high-ranking official in the German army named Major Julius Schmeling, who grew more and more convinced of what they were doing was wrong. And so he started using his influence and his power to protect little villages and little places of refuge like that one in our story. So things would start happening like in the middle of the night, Andre, the preacher in the village, would get a call about this raid that's about to happen. And sometimes some other German officials who had grown rather convinced that this was not right, when they would come to do the raids and the checks of town, they would march right down Main Street for all to see and stop into the cafe and have a long cup of coffee before they went about their raids. And these things started happening all around this village as people looked in and saw their faithful courage, a faith like Daniel had, and they saw it as worthy of deliverance. It may not always happen that way. But we're now in the final part of this Wednesday series on Joseph and Daniel. And in this last bit, we're going to be talking about, okay, so what are the outcomes that we hope for? What are the things that we can hope will happen if we learn to be faithfully in this world but not of it? And we learn to have courage and faith like Daniel did, even when we're in a place and in a time where we might feel like a fish out of water. What can God do with that? What can we hope will happen? What good outcomes might come of that? And tonight we see one of them. When we're faithful to God, we can trust that God will vindicate that faithfulness. He will deliver us in his time, because that is the God that we serve. And we may even find that when we put our trust in God and live accordingly, it may have an influence on the people around us for the better as well, like that village did, and like Daniel did too. maybe even from us, someone might learn what they've been missing so that they too can know the rest of the story. Maybe this speaks to you tonight. Maybe it's encouraging to you to think about the power that God has to deliver and to save, and that though it occurs in His timing and not on our time, that it is something we can put our confidence in and our trust in. Maybe that's the kind of detail that you can take with you in your life, and it can encourage you toward faithful living, like Daniel showed in his. Maybe for somebody, it's the salvation of God that's on your mind tonight as we think about a God who delivers. Perhaps someone watching online or someone here tonight. And you want to side with the God who saves and loves in this way. When we're baptized into Christ, we experience deliverance from the power of sin. Though Satan is compared to a lion in the Scriptures, his power is nothing compared to the power of Christ at work in our lives. Maybe you need to take hold of that. However you might be called or challenged this evening, we would invite your response while we stand and sing.